NEWSMAKERS program. Our guest this week is Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, Republican, freshman, and one of the founders of the Senate Tea Party caucus. He's joining us from Capitol Hill. Senator, thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you, Susan.
Our reporters are Major Garrett, who covers Congress for the National Journal, and Jonathan Allen, who covers Congress for Politico. And Major, we're just going to start with a question from you.
Okay. Senator Paul, a couple of questions. First of all, do you believe the August 2nd deadline established by Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner is a real deadline? And if you were to describe for your constituents in Kentucky the damage that would be done to the U.S. economy if that date were missed and the United States were to fall into technical default, what would you tell them? And do you believe there would be significant economic consequences, as President Obama said this week?
Well, I think ultimately if a country keeps spending more than it takes in, that it has to borrow more money. So I think ultimately that's true. What I would say about there being a deadline is, the deadline's already been moved 3 or 4 months, and there's already rumors from the administration they could move it again. The real thing, though, is that people need to realize is we bring in about $200 billion in revenue every month, and we spend about $20 billion on interest. So there's plenty of tax revenue to keep paying the interest on our debt and to never default. And in fact, I think the responsible thing for the president to do really is to take it off the table and say, look, we won't default. We will continue to pay our interest no matter what because we want to keep our good credit rating, and we think it's the appropriate and the right thing to do.
Let me follow up on that if I could, Senator, because the president said at the press conference today, and there's a bipartisan policy commission study on this, that there would be significant things that the United States government could not do if the default situation were to occur. Yes, the bondholders could be paid, but other obligations already agreed to, already guaranteed, could not be financed. And we have to make very tough choices about the things we could not do, and that prioritizing would inflict some damage. Do you disagree?
Yeah, the interesting thing is you're right. For a change up here, we might have to prioritize. We might have to be true legislators and decide what we have money for and what we don't have money for. I'm reminded of yesterday on the floor, Senator Johans from Nebraska talked about when he was governor of Nebraska, there was a red line, and he had money for that above the red line and no money for that below it. So he had to make choices. If it was below the red line, he had to take away something from above the red line. That's what the American people expect, that we make difficult choices. But in Washington, for 40 years, we've just been adding program after program after program. We can't do that anymore. We do need to make tough choices. And you're right. If we didn't raise the debt ceiling, it would be like passing an immediate balanced budget. And, we only bring in revenue for about 70% of what we do up here. So it would be significant cuts. But you could still pay the interest. You could pay Social Security checks. You could pay the soldiers' salaries. But there'd be a lot of stuff like the 82 programs we have up here that are duplicate programs to train workers. You might have to get rid of 81 of them.
John?
Senator, I'd like to ask you about the keeper of that August 2nd debt limit deadline, Timothy Geithner. He's expected to leave fairly soon. He's let it be known to the White House that after that's taken care of, he wants to get gone. I wonder, who do you think would make a good Treasury Secretary, and what should they be looking to do?
Well, I've never been that excited about who the president has picked to help us with our financial problems. Both Ben Bernanke and Timothy Geithner did not predict the housing bubble, and in fact their policies, I think, were what created the housing bubble and the ensuing collapse in the housing market and the enormous recession that we're now suffering from and the joblessness. I put at the feet of Ben Bernanke and Timothy Geithner, so I think it was an enormous mistake and wrong policy to appoint them to high office after I think they failed us during the housing boom and crisis. Who particular to pick? I think it would have to be somebody who believes in the marketplace, that interest rates should not be manipulated by the government, that credit should not be manipulated by the government, and that we should allow the marketplace to help us make wise decisions about what the price of things should be.
Can you throw out a name? Is there somebody that would be your dream candidate?
Well, no. I think it's probably better to talk about the policies that I think the person would be for. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to get any say, nor will Republicans, unless we get a new president. And that's going to be a year or two in the coming.
Senator, following up on that question, do you think that this Treasury Secretary nominee, should Treasury Secretary Geithner leave, would be the kind of nominee that could be subject to a filibuster? There have been other nominees that are currently being blocked by the Senate Republicans. Is that something that Washington should gird itself for?
Well, I think it's hard to make a prediction on what people will do not knowing who the nominee is. I think that what I will argue for is that we should try to get someone who has an appreciation of the marketplace and business. Really, the biggest complaint that I've had with this administration, and I talk to business people every day, they think this is the most anti-business administration we've ever had. Business is beleaguered. The reports are that many of the folks in this administration have never run businesses. So really what we'd like to see is somebody with business experience, but I'd also like to see someone who believes in the free marketplace, who believes in capitalism, who believes in the greatness of what America has produced in the past and could produce in the future. But really that's not meaning that we need more shovel-ready jobs. What we need is more relief for the businesses that are creating the jobs, and I don't think this administration understands that.
And Senator, getting back to the debt talks, the impasse currently is over taxes. Is there any tax increase at all put on the table by the administration, whether it deals with corporate jets or inventories, or maybe even a change in the way the government calculates the consumer price index, a chained approach as opposed to the one we currently have now, which might not be a pure tax increase, but it would be a change in policy. Is any of that acceptable to you, and do you believe it would be acceptable to those who have been inspired by the Tea Party caucus, either in the House or the Senate?
Well, you know what's funny is just last week, I think 70 of us, including in all of the Tea Party caucus, voted to get rid of the ethanol credit. So we're more than willing to look at the tax code. The tax code, though, when we look at it, if we're going to do overall tax reform, we want lower rates and simplification of rates to go along with getting rid of special tax cuts that distort the tax credits and tax deductions sometimes that distort the marketplace. But if we're just going to go through and pick out 100 tax deductions to get rid of, that essentially is going to punish the marketplace, make it more difficult for jobs, and I think the vast majority of economists have said it's not a good idea to have a big tax increase in the middle of a recession. But what I would say is that there is common ground with the Democrats. The Democrats think that the rich should have more of a burden. Well, we already have a progressive tax code, so the rich do pay more in taxes. But if they want the rich to have more of a burden in trying to figure out how to correct this debt problem, one way we could do it, and I think this is the common ground if people would get together and talk about it, is means testing on benefits. I'm all for means testing on Social Security and Medicare. That would allow the rich to absorb more of a burden, would allow them to pay more for their Medicare, more of the cost, and I think this would please the Democrats, and it would be the compromise because Republicans, most of us don't want to raise taxes, but we would accept the rich having more of the burden by reducing their benefits.
Overall, the tax code is a pretty complicated topic to tackle in such a short amount of time. We keep hearing suggestions about delaying the decision-making and doing a temporary measure right now. Would you support a temporary fix to tackle these bigger topics you've suggested?
Well, you know, I was part of a group this week that said no more. We're tired of talking about extraneous issues. We've had not 1 minute of debate about the debt ceiling in any committee. We haven't had a budget in 2 years. We haven't had an appropriations bill in 2 years. So I'm part of the freshman group in the Senate that's saying no more. We're not going to let them go to any issue if we have a say in it. So next week, we will filibuster until we talk about the debt ceiling, until we talk about proposals. And many of us in the conservative wing are going to present our own proposal next week, and that is to raise the debt ceiling. We will actually vote in favor of raising the debt ceiling next week if we can, but it'll be contingent upon passing a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The thing is that American people don't want us just to raise the debt ceiling, keep doing everything what we've been doing. Only 14% of the American voters approve of what we've been doing, and it's been a disaster up here for the country. So if we don't change our ways, they don't want us to raise the debt ceiling. But I will vote. I'm not completely without the sense that we may need to raise the debt ceiling, but I will only do it if we have significant budgetary reform, and to me that means you have to balance your budget every year.
Mr. Allen?
Senator, I wanted to ask you, there's been some mention of the Tea Party caucus, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on how Tea Party groups are influencing the way that Congress operates, the way that lawmakers make their decisions, both those who identify with the Tea Party caucus and maybe others who don't as much but are starting to pay attention. Because there's a lot of, I think, mistaken ideas and a lot of belief in perhaps a uniformity of thought on things, and I'm just curious how you think they're affecting Congress.
Well, I'd say the one uniform proposal that comes out of the Tea Party that I think we're in universal agreement, no matter who the person is that the number one concern for the country and for our people is the debt. We're worried about a looming debt crisis, and we think that the nation may not be able to withstand this amount of debt. And we're not alone. I mean, you probably wouldn't say Admiral Mullen from this current administration is a Tea Partier, but he said that the number one threat to our national security is our debt. People are waking up on all sides, Republicans, Independents, Democrats, that debt's a problem and that we may not be able to withstand it. Larry Lindsey wrote a Wall Street Journal editorial just this week, and in it he said, look, if interest rates go back to their historical average of about 5.5%, we'll add $5 trillion more to the debt in the next decade. It's unsustainable. We really are headed for a crisis. People are saying it's the most predictable crisis that we've ever had in our country, but we've got to do something now, and it really is going to take something different than business as usual. Business as usual up here is, well, we'll talk about a cut, and we'll talk about a cut that'll come in over 10 years. It won't happen. Nobody believes it, and we can't bind future Congresses. So the only way we would ever change the culture of Washington and the future of our country is to bind future Congresses by changing our Constitution.
So would you say then that the main effect of the Tea Party has been to have this debate about the debt, to not just simply raise the debt ceiling as has been done in the past?
Well, I'd say what we're doing is I think we're controlling the debate, to tell you the truth. I think the Tea Party and those of us who are concerned about the debt, I think we have the public with us. We are monopolizing the public debate, and we're still losing most of the legislative battles. But, you don't always win in the beginning, but I think we're shaping the debate, and by all means, I think we are having an influence on what will come out of this.
Senator Paul, I've looked at the constitutional amendment. If I recall correctly, and please, I invite you to correct me if I'm wrong on this, 18% spending as a percentage of GDP, and then supermajorities to raise taxes over and above that. Do I have that correct, sir?
Yes.
Okay. I grew up in California. California, in its legislature, has a similar sort of, at least bias against tax increases, and legislators have to reach a certain supermajority to increase spending, yet California has been bedeviled by budget crises for the past decade. Even components like this don't guarantee you're not going to have budget crises. So what would you tell the American people is going to be the silver bullet of your kind of constitutional amendment, where at the state level it's proven that if you have a bad economy or you spend too much, you still have these budget issues?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think there is no guarantee that any one law will make us better legislators, but it works in many different states. I think that when we have this debate, what you brought up will be a very important point, and we're going to have to examine California and examine why California's balanced budget amendment doesn't work. But in many states it does work. It works in Nebraska. It works to a certain extent in Kentucky. In Kentucky, we're still allowed to borrow in addition, so that's the problem. And I think it's the same in California. They have to balance their budget, but they're allowed to balance it with borrowed money. And they're reaching limits out there. I mean, California and Illinois are in danger of bankruptcy, and so they aren't good examples. But there are good examples out. I think 49 states have some kind of provision about balancing their budget. Some are better than others, but we want it to be a strong provision because really the system's not working. And anybody who's objective and examines the way Washington's working would say that it's absolutely broken and it just isn't working, and the deficit gets larger and larger. I mean, we can't sustain $1.5 trillion deficits every year.
Would you acknowledge, Senator, that you don't have the votes or not even really close to having the votes to pass this in the Senate?
Oh, no, I would never acknowledge that. It's true,
though, isn't it?
Well, I don't know what is true and what isn't true. I would say that I'm an optimist, and I see the opportunity and difficulty, as Winston Churchill said, and not the difficulty and opportunity. So I am an optimist, and the thing is I think we've got 47 votes. All 47 Republicans have signed on in the Senate. I think in the House, I think we actually are very close to getting the 2/3. What I've been telling folks is I'd like to see the House vote first, I'd like to see the House get the 2/3. It'll take some work. It takes about 40 or 50 Democrats. But realize that this is an incredibly popular issue. It's almost passed before. It's lost by 1 vote in the Senate before and 1 vote in the House before over the last 25 years. And if you poll this question, 70 to 75% of Democrats in the public, of voters, are for this. Republicans also, independents also. It polls across all party lines. So to Democrats who want to vote against a balanced budget, I say at your own peril. And I say come to us and work with us, and let's get it passed for the good of the country. This is beyond party politics. I'll stand up on national TV and say, look, Republicans have been part of the problem. It's not just the Democrats. But we both need this restraint. And if we don't get this restraint, the country's going to hell in a handbasket.
10 minutes left.
But Senator, let me just ask you this. There are different iterations of a balanced budget amendment, and the ones that were being looked at in the mid-1990s are very different than the one you're looking at now, in particular with their treatment of taxes and the ability of Congresses, future Congresses, to raise them if they wanted to. Why not work with the Democrats to find something that would appeal to them in terms of coming on board? You said you need to get about 50 of them in the House. Why not work with them on that?
Well, you got to start somewhere, and they haven't introduced anything, and we are going to introduce something. So what I would say is the only way to know what happens is you introduce what you want, and if you can get some people who say, oh, we're 10 votes short, will you do this to the bill? I think probably you end up having to talk to the people to get the 10 votes. But the thing is we have to get started and see if any of them are willing to discuss it with us. If the Democrat Party is going to uniformly oppose a balanced budget amendment, then we won't get to the point of compromise. But if 40 or 50 of them in the House and 20 of them in the Senate want to get together and say, we'll do it if we get this, then of course there'll have to be discussions. I worry about giving up the supermajority to raise taxes, though, because I don't want this to be a prescription to raise taxes. I think that would be devastating for us right now to have a significant tax raise.
If I could switch gears with you for a second, I want to ask you about your dad. If I'm an Iowa conservative caucus goer, why do I vote for Ron Paul instead of, say, Michelle Bachmann, who's polling in the low 20% right now?
Well, I think the interesting thing about my dad is that he's been right about every economic issue of the last 20 years. In 2003, in the Banking Committee, he said it was coming. He said explicitly the housing bubble is going to get bigger and we're going to crash. And it's because we're subsidizing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and telling people to buy houses with no down payment. He said it was coming. He's also been somebody who's been a little different than some Republicans in that he believes that our foreign policy should be constitutional, that you shouldn't go to war simply on the word of a president, that you should have congressional debate and congressional authorization for war. That's what the Constitution says. He's led this battle, and actually many in the Republican Party, including Michelle Bachmann, are coming in his direction on this. The debate over Libya really shows the influence, I think, of Ron Paul in the Republican Party. I mean, that you actually have majorities or near majorities who say that the president's wrong for going to war without congressional authority.
Speaking of Libya, that's supposed to be on the Senate floor next week. And you intimated a minute ago that you would try to filibuster whatever is supposed to be on the floor in order to bring up the debt. Does that also mean you'd filibuster a move to bring the Libya resolution sponsored by Senator McCain and Senator Kerry to the floor?
Yeah, the interesting thing is I've been one of the most vocal in the Senate for debating Libya and bringing it to the floor. I wanted to bring it into the floor when it was still within the realm of the law. Now the president's evaded the law and says it's not really a war, and he's shown utter disdain for Congress, utter disdain for the Constitution. He now has I guess really gall's the best word, to tell the American public that it's not a war because they're not shooting back. And I think really people see that, and they're really concerned with a person that will so manipulate the facts to say fighting and bombing is not war. We've already missed all the deadlines, and so what I'm saying is we weren't supposed to be in session at all next week. Libya would have had to occur the following week. We insisted on coming back next week to talk about the debt, and we want to put up a proposal. We will actually introduce a proposal to raise the debt ceiling contingent on a balanced budget next week. That's what we want to talk about, and I think Libya can wait another week because the president's already ignoring all the deadlines and rules anyway.
While we have you, Senator, your reaction to the president's press conference on Wednesday and his suggestion that his two daughters are more disciplined and efficient about their homework than Congress is about its business.
You know, I sensed a certain air of arrogance that I don't think the American public are going to be too happy with. And the next day, we were wanting to debate it. And what did the Democrats do? They adjourned. And I asked, where was the president? He was campaigning and fundraising in Philadelphia. Where was the vice president? Campaigning and fundraising in Las Vegas. So I think it's a bit galling that he gets up in front of the American public and says, oh, Congress is not doing their job, and here we are standing there trying to get an agreement. We can't get a vote to the floor because the Democrats prevent it, and then he's jetting off on a private jet, not a private jet, a taxpayer-funded jet to go campaign.
5 minutes left.
Senator, I want to ask you about some home state politics. You obviously were not supported in your primary by the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell. I'm curious, are you going to support him for re-election when he comes up in, I think, 2014?
I can't imagine not. That's a long time from now, but Senator McConnell and I get along quite well, and he's been a great leader actually in this balanced budget amendment fight. You know, he's gotten all 47 senators together doing this, and so I can't imagine anything but supporting him at this point.
And Senator, continuing the conversation about the balanced budget, what would you say to those who revere the Constitution? I'm not suggesting you don't, but who believe it is somewhat polluting to the Constitution to put something so specific, like 18% of GDP for federal spending, in the Constitution itself, which has always been not only a simple but very clear document that set out broad parameters, not granular details about budgetary issues?
Yeah, I guess it gets back to the whole California thing. I mean, the California balanced budget's not working, so maybe a balanced budget amendment does have to have more detail. But those are things that can come out in the debate, and I think that are open for discussion. The fear, though, is that we really don't want a budget that balances at 25% of GDP. Right now, we're spending $1 in $4 in Washington, whereas just 2 or 3 years ago, it was $1 in $5. So we've ratcheted up the percentage of the economy that's being consumed by by government expenditures, and we want a smaller government. The other thing that's interesting is that no matter what the tax rates are, 18% is about what comes in. Back in the 50s, the high tax rates were 70 and 90% for the various high income, and it brought in about 18% of GDP. We got the rates down to 28%, and guess what it brought in? About 18% of GDP. It's interestingly that it's hard to coax more than that out of the economy because wealthy folks a lot of times leave or take their capital overseas if the taxes are lower in another country. So really 18% is about, historically, over 60 years, we really have never gotten much more than 18%. So if you want to balance your budget, you got to get expenditures down to where revenues typically are.
Senator, do you expect this debt limit issue to be resolved in one fell swoop, or do you think there may be multiple bites, that is to say a lift in the cap for enough to negotiate more and a couple votes on it?
I don't know. I think that the only way they can get my vote and several of our votes, at least 12 of us have signed and said there have to be significant cuts, statutory caps, and a balanced budget amendment of the Constitution. So we just think Washington's so broken. The American people don't want more of the same. They don't trust the folks up here who've been running the show, and they want something different. I was elected on a wave, this Tea Party wave that came, and the people in Kentucky would not understand it at all, and I think would rightfully vote against me if I just said, oh, let's raise the debt ceiling without significantly reforming the process.
Does that mean that you don't trust the people that have been up here? Mitch McConnell, Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, John Boehner, they've all been around for decades, moving in and out of leadership. Do you trust these guys?
I don't like to make it about any individuals, and I think particularly on our side, you know, Mitch McConnell has led the fight to get all 47 on board for a balanced budget amendment, so I don't place the blame there. But I don't trust the system of the way we've been appropriating money. I don't trust the lack of restraint. You know, originally, for about 150 years, our Constitution really did restrain the size and growth of government. We believed in what were called the Constitution calls the enumerated powers. There were only very specific things that could be done in Washington. But then we got this expansive notion of the Commerce Clause. It's kind of how they're trying to justify Obamacare. But it's a notion really that government can do anything. I will jokingly say in my speeches that if my shoes were made in Tennessee, they can regulate my walking in Kentucky. That wasn't what was intended by our founding fathers. The Commerce Clause meant that they wanted free trade between Tennessee and Kentucky. They didn't want Kentucky to set up barriers to trade with Tennessee, and that's all it was about. But it wasn't about really getting involved with all the manufacturing within the states and having a huge government presence from Washington in all the states.
We are out of time, Senator. Maybe your question at the end here about your optimism that a deal will come together.
All right. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks. Let me turn to Major